Commerce. Students of commerce will be familiar with the story of the beneficial effect of free market capitalism, and life conditions for the average person have in many ways improved exponentially since the Industrial Revolution. Mankind now has the comfort of heated and air-conditioned insulated houses, the benefit of refrigeration which allows food to be stored in ideal conditions as it is transported thousands of miles. Winter, as a time of frugality while waiting for the spring harvests, has become all but meaningless. People can buy oranges and strawberries throughout the year at local markets. Capital can be raised internationally to give rise to ever larger ventures that would once have been impossible. Risks that were once considered catastrophic are now so spread as to be non-issues. Banks are regulated, insulated from their own thirst for speculation. Deposits are insured by the government to prevent collapse in the event of uncertainty. Business entities have developed to an efficiency never known before. They produce just about anything the populace might need or want, and the owners are insulated from the risks of their venture, so they can feel confident investing their money while retaining the possibility of influence as shareholders. In the Western system, with the exception of, proportionally speaking, a very few, everyone has food, clothing, and shelter. In most modern industrial states, state-supported systems of welfare even provide for those who cannot provide for themselves. But it is not only the necessities of life that are provided by this system. There are also non-necessities, items owned for mere enjoyment, mere indulgence. People do not have only one or two sets of clothes, they have closets and drawers full. This possibility, this luxury, is very largely a result of financial markets and transactional businesses. They allow the possibility of the cheap production and transportation of goods. But the process comes with a cost. To protect the ability to have whatever mankind wants for as little as possible, mankind has, since the beginning of industrialization, ignored the effect of the satisfaction of unnecessary desires on the natural world, including on the quality of life lived by those who make, transport, and consume the goods. Responsibility for this willing oversight can be attributed to those who, as managers of commercial enterprises, consciously avoid taking responsibility for the wreckage caused in the course of increasing profits to the extent possible regardless of harm. And it can be attributed to those in government who, as representatives of the people, fail to responsibly allocate the costs to the enterprises that brought them about. And it can be attributed to the consuming public who turned a blind eye out of a desire to preserve the artificially low prices that allow them to indulge, while, through a failure of consideration, avoiding any sense of responsibility. There are several reasons why these checks and balances failed, but they all come back to the same origin: greed and misguided selfishness. The ideal of self-governance, a cornerstone of free market philosophy, has failed to adequately materialize. Business managers realize that their own self-interest is best served by producing profit at any cost, as they are themselves monetarily rewarded for precisely that behavior. Governments have a responsibility to the people they represent, but governments are generally made up of people who can afford the costs of entering government, or who are willing to sacrifice integrity so as to exist in government. These people, whether they are of a segment of society with investments in the entities they might be asked to hold to account, or whether they rely on funding from industry in their political life, generally become quickly beholden to commercial interests if they are not beholden already. It is from this position of investment and indebtedness that politicians speak of the protection of the markets and the importance of the growth of the economy, while ignoring systemic faults that will eventually cause a complete breakdown of the way of life they have enjoyed. Further, as members of the public themselves, they are subject to the same desires for consumption as the populace they represent. Mankind has now entered into a new phase of commercialism, with the rise of the virtual environment and the devices that access that environment. Business interests, through media, control an ever-increasing extent of the influences that affect individual people and the societies they make up. People think they live in a world of free media. They are told repeatedly of the importance of freedom, of the extent of freedom, and yet all the vast majority of people have is the freedom to choose between a carefully limited number of not necessarily accurate pieces of information handed to them by organizations that are, to their core, ingrained with conflicts of interest. The gains humanity has made in the area of commerce are clear. However, the externalization of cost by commercial enterprises must be corrected as the survival of mankind is at stake. Humans must, as individuals, surmount their craving for comfort and luxury regardless of its cost. Humans must redevelop a comprehension of need and act according to it. Acting on a comprehension of need requires the redirection of resources to develop greater resilience in the market and to prune away branches that undermine the effort through their appeal simply to the growth and satisfaction of desire. Creative destruction applies in the context of every aspect of economic endeavor. The process must be balanced to reflect its intention. To create requires repurposing of material, repurposing of effort. This repurposing makes destruction inevitable. It is the choice to destroy so as to create. But restructuring requires recognition of the preference to save that which might be saved. In the case of business structures, efforts are compartmentalized into their roles. They are isolated into individualized intents within the mix of the overall effort. This same holds true for the business itself within its environment. It is not wrong for businesses to be thought of as entities. Businesses are entities. They are interconnected with employees, with consumers, and with each other. They emit influences that are generally far stronger than that of any individual human. They have specific interests. They require specific nutrients to feed their ability to meet those interests. They have environments they exist in. They have bodies they must apply. They have minds with which to manage and control. And they have spirit in the form of their collective will towards their objective. Businesses have competing interests within themselves and with other businesses in their environment. Each of these competing interests represents different influences arguing for different strategies to achieve increased benefit. And businesses must position themselves so as to survive. The life of a business is the life of an individual. It relies on other businesses to the extent of its supply chain, to the extent of its outreach. It relies on its reputation. It relies on its behavior. Its expansion into its environment requires its growth be allowed and encouraged. It is subject to pre-existing, pre-established forces of influence, forces that can encourage it or punish it. The force that encourages a business is the value placed on it in the marketplace by the society. The society demonstrates its valuation by the share of its wealth it directs to the business. Businesses are not merely individuals, they are communities. They come together to form enterprises that operate symbiotically to achieve a result that benefits all within the enterprise. Such enterprises can be intertwined even with competing enterprises within sectors of like businesses, where each has the shared interest of maintaining an environment that is most beneficial for the sector that the competing interests rely on. Sectors themselves are thus individual entities made up of multitudes of related enterprises, which are themselves made up of multitudes of entities, which are themselves made up of multitudes of individuals. Business sectors compete with other business sectors for access to resources. They compete to convince, remind, and reinforce society's recognition of the need for the products they produce. They compete with those that would question their reputation for the attention of the consumer. The greater their perceived importance in the context of the society, the greater the share of the society's wealth they stand to channel their way. While the actuality of need is objective, the perception of need is subjective and malleable. The manipulation of the perception of need requires influencing perceptions of risk so as to leverage a motive force through aversion and desire. Aversion can be reinforced by increasing perception of influences that stoke sadness or fear. By establishing a counterpoint that gives rise to fear or sadness, a product or service can be positioned to be presented as a solution. Desire can be reinforced through developing in people the notion that happiness should be their objective, and by influencing the consumer to calibrate their senses to train their emotional response to pursue happiness in certain contexts rather than others. To the extent consumers can be convinced they need a product, through manipulated desire or through a manipulated sense of need, the sector and the enterprises and entities within it stand to benefit. Not every degree of manipulation may be considered to be malign. Those who work in a given sector are immersed in the considerations of that sector. Their awareness of the problem their product exists to solve is more acute than that of another whose attention is directed elsewhere. Also, different people have different sensitivities to risk as a result of having a different calibrated emotional response mechanism, or as a result of having been exposed to a different set of evidence leading to a different threat assessment. While a degree of inefficiency through subjective judgment is therefore bound to exist, That chronic baseline inefficiency can be magnified into acute risks when perceptions are too far distorted from reality. The distortion of mistaking desire for need would not be an issue if there were no costs to it, but there is a cost. The cost of human comfort in its current form includes the destruction of ecosystems around the planet. It includes the pollution of oceans and waterways. It includes the melting of glaciers and ice caps. It has, since the Industrial Revolution, included the shifting of the workforce from farm, where families could remain fundamentally interconnected, to the isolation of factory and office. Until the middle of the 20th century, the acquisition of anything that was not strictly necessary was limited to a very small class of the economically rich, and to what had been conceived to be manufactured. From the middle of the 20th century, a surge of productivity took place within the newfound security of Western markets. A new middle class had entered the marketplace, new materials had been devised, new products could be provided to bolster the sense of the importance of comfort and convenience in life. A semblance of the old way remained, the notion of waste not, want not. These were, after all, still children of the old way. But taught to consume, encouraged to consume on the basis of the benefit of economic growth, on the basis of a sense of deserving, they never taught their children the lesson their parents had been born into. The baseline had shifted. Consumption on the basis of desire was the norm, and it was ready to grow. Once the middle class were attended to, the next was to attend to the lower class. The basis for this approach was the notion that all should get to consume, that it would not be fair if only some people were able to consume on the basis of desire alone. But production costs would not allow for the economics, so production costs had to be lowered. Production costs are lowered through decreasing the cost of production methods, through using cheaper materials and cheaper labor, and through economies of scale. By looking to provide for the masses, the potential for economies of scale in terms of raw materials, production facilities, and shipping was almost unlimited. But to bring production costs down, labor needs to shift to where it expects less. The process of lowering costs of production and transport to the extent that the entire Western population could have access to the developed joy of consumption meant that entire industries needed to shift production to developing nations where labor costs were negligible. Entire productive sectors of the workforce were made redundant, and meanwhile the plastics used in the production of the goods, due to raw material saving, weight saving, and ease of increasingly automated production, became ubiquitous to the point that plastic fibers can be found anywhere in the world, from the deepest oceanic trenches to the stomachs of seabirds in the Arctic. The manufacturing sector met another barrier with the saturation of savings in the developing world. To answer this issue, robots have been developed, first operated by man, then increasingly automated to the current time where artificial intelligence is being developed to not just make the factory worker redundant, but also the technician who once was required to operate the machines, and the office worker employed to analyze and make decisions regarding not just production, but also choices about which products to develop. At that point, the snake is mindlessly eating its own tail out of a sheer habit of consumption. All the while, the entire society becomes increasingly disconnected from indicators of actual need. Distracted by uncertainty amidst a universe of competing interests, almost all representing fabrications of deceptive import, the individual is compelled not to question the nature of what has become, not only his entire reality, but also the entire reality of the environment in which he exists. From that state of mind, he is expected by the institutions of his state to apply an informed voice within the context of representative government. The individual in this context, the society in this context, will fail the institution. Institutions are structures by which to channel influence towards certain ends. The institution of democratic government is an ideal that is either met by the populace or not. When the populace does not meet the requirements of the institution, it does not necessarily mean the institution is false or outdated. It can mean that the populace has failed to live up to the baseline requirements the institution requires if it is to provide the benefit it has the potential to provide. While enriching themselves in the present by acting to distort consumers' conceptions of need, businesses corrupt and corrode the ability in the individual and thus in society to distinguish need. This then is carried over into the context of societal governance, in how people conduct themselves, in the integrity of individuals, and in the choosing and conduct of those picked to represent them in government. Just as certain sectors of business compete within the overall marketplace, so too does business as a whole compete with government for influence in the development of society. To the extent business can influence government to act in favor of its interests, the more it may influence its own power of further enrichment. That enrichment, if not checked, siphons resources ever more effectively into the spheres of fewer and fewer controlling interests. Where this process is allowed to develop to the point it becomes fundamentally offensive, revolutions take place. Revolutions are like wildfires in a dry forest. Everything is burned. Everything must start afresh. And in the process, everything must fight. There is no comfort. There is no security. The most ambitious, the most callous are favored. Life is returned to its brute form. Civilization takes generations to develop. Not a single civilization reached that status through negligence and wastefulness. Not one reached that status through lack of consideration, through being disjointed from actual necessity. Civilization appears in societies that have had time to establish a position of actual disciplined consistency of strength to afford a lean security that itself allows for the consideration of matters that go beyond the immediate. Civilization, in other words, is a state of a society that is sufficiently well managed in terms of its provision to meet actual needs, to value contemplation and implementation of ideal purpose. To achieve civilization, business interests must be aligned with the implementation of ideal purpose. Business interests should be, just as government should be, directed in pursuit of that purpose, to increase its potential for manifestation, to implement its manifestation to the extent possible. Civilization requires fundamental principles be shared throughout the self-governance of the society. It is not sufficient for business and government to be structured as adversarial. It is not sufficient for business to take control of government, such that the society is governed not by ideal purpose, but by enslavement to the assumed potential for economic growth. The ownership of government by business increases the temporary externalization of the costs of the mode of living employed. This externalization is temporary because in a closed environment the costs do not go away. They sink into the environment, into the psychology of individuals, into the traits of the society, and quietly corrode the poorly manufactured foundations upon which the falsehood stands. The extent of what is built on those foundations will fall, and when it does, it will bring down more with it in addition. Business should be limited to meeting in the most efficient way possible the actual needs of the society. It should do this with the specific objective that in so doing it may ease the society to employ itself towards ever greater manifestations of civilization. This evolution is made possible through increased objective understanding of the natural environment, through science, through the increased realization of the human experience, through the arts, philosophy, the study of history, through the consideration of societal objectives. Business should be of sufficient moral value in its objective and practice that it can realistically and truly operate as an extension of the social life of the family and of the community towards the interests of families and communities, and not just in the sense of providing the means to place food on the table. The food that goes on the table and then into the physical body is insufficient to establish civilization. Civilization requires that nutrition be sourced not just for the body, but also for the mind and spirit. These require that action, investment of the individual energy be actually valuable. The notion that extracurricular or outside of work activities should be sufficient to feed those requirements is insufficient. The time outside of work should not need to be taken up with activities designed to bring the individual back into harmony with his spirit, simply as a result of having spent a day working in an environment that directly corrodes harmony with his spirit. The work environment and the working objective should actually build the self-worth of the worker. The worker should not be fooled into thinking what he does is valuable where it is not. But neither should he have to make excuses for himself to himself, or avoid doing so through repression of fundamental discontent.